Great. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to the Land Dialogue webinar series, which is organized in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Thin, and I'm a journalist specializing in food systems and climate change, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session on climate funding and COP28, turning pledges into action. Now, the idea behind this webinar series is to raise awareness on the land rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, these rights, we believe, are a prerequisite to achieve national and international goals around forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. Now, this is our fourth and final land dialogue for this year. But first, before we start our discussion, I'm just going to go through some housekeeping rules. Now, this webinar is mainly going to be conducted in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, but we also have simultaneous translations in French, as well as the other languages that I just mentioned. To access the translation, all you have to do is go to the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, click on it, and select the language that you want. Now, this webinar is going to be 60 minutes. We've set aside about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box and not the chat box. But do use the chat box, as I see others are already using, to introduce yourselves. Also, feel free to tweet using the hashtag LandDialogues, which is just one word, LandDialogues. And you can also follow the live tweeting from the Land Portal and Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. And finally, we are also recording today's session, and we will share the link with you later. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's turn to today's topic. Now, the past two UN climate summits have been big on promises for Indigenous peoples. At COP26 in 2021, governments and private philanthropies pledged nearly $2 billion for Indigenous peoples and local communities to fight deforestation. Last year, at COP27, there was a creation of a new loss and damage fund to help vulnerable communities respond to the climate disasters. Leaders are again preparing for another round of climate talks at COP28, which is going to start later this week in Dubai. And this time, they're vowing to enhance the participation and visibility of Indigenous peoples during the negotiations. But as we all know, having the funds or just being able to participate is not enough. The funds need to reach the right people and at scale. But is that happening? And if not, then why is that not happening? Can the newly established Indigenous-led funds lead the way forward? Well, we have a fantastic group of speakers who are going to answer these questions. And in the interest of fairness, I am going to introduce them in alphabetical order. So first, we have Casey Box, who is the Director of Global Strategy at the Christensen Fund. Now, Casey is committed to supporting Indigenous rights, participatory grant-making, and grassroots network building. We also have Deborah Sanchez from the Honduras Mosquito Group, who is a longtime Indigenous leader, and she recently took on the role of director with Community Land Rights and Conservation Finance Initiative, or CLARIFY for short. We also have Jenny Lopez, who is a land governance advisor responsible for land tenure rights programming and policy work at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And we have Valeria Paye from the Tirio and Castellana people of the Parque do Tumucumaque indigenous land in the states of Pará and Amapá in Brazil. Valeria, I am so sorry if I mispronounced those names. Now, Valeria is the head of the executive board of the Podali, which is an indigenous fund of the Brazilian Amazon. And last, but definitely not the least, we have Josimara Meguerio, who is from the Bare people, and she is the coordinator of the Rio Indigenous Fund. This is an initiative from a federation that actually represents 23 Indigenous peoples living in the Rio Negro in the Amazonas. So it's great to have this group of donors as well as Indigenous leaders present to have this discussion. So I think the first question I would like to ask to all of our speakers is to sort of reflect a little bit back on the discussion that we had last year on the donor promises to Indigenous communities. Can we perhaps talk about where, whether those promises have been fulfilled? So I'd like to ask our speakers to sort of briefly talk about perhaps one key win, as well as one major challenge or obstacle that have, emerged since last year's climate summit. Deborah, perhaps I can start with you for the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Tine, for the opportunity. And I want to reflect on that. We probably have already reached like this key milestone where we all have a common understanding of the importance of the flexible that the funds needs to be, like a fewer administrative hurdles, and then how we need to be in the center of the design of these funds. So now we're talking about effective participation, flexibility, and how that can look like and how can we implement. So I think that we are going from that phase to the implementation phase. And where we're moving towards that, I think that one of the very important key issues is that we are being reimagining the funding ecosystem, right? We are being creating like these led funds by Indigenous peoples, local community, Afro-descendant peoples, and how we govern these funds and how we put these funds together and how we start moving forward and working with them. And the most important thing is for me that we are creating actual lesson learned. We are creating experiences. We are doing it, and then that will bring us a lot of the knowledge that we need to move forward. But of course, in the obstacles we are facing, that is hard to really implement and recreate things where the system is already set up, right? So we really need to start looking at the more systematic approach and how we can make flexibility, how we can actually demonstrate on the ground. And we've seen that the tendency that a lot of the philanthropies are moving a lot faster on that part, on that way, but then we're still seeing a lot of the people from the bilaterals that also working on that and looking at how we can have effective participation and how the flexibility can look like. From our side, I think we've been like working hard in developing these funds, and now we have established in global level funds, regional funds, national funds, and that are working. So I think this is the greatest approach or takeaway that I can have from our side.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That's actually very encouraging to hear. Valeria and Josimara, can I ask you to also briefly talk about one key win and a challenge? Valeria, could I perhaps start with you, and then we'll go to Josimara? Great.
Bom dia a todos aqui no Brasil, na Amazônia brasileira de Manaus. Estamos nós duas participando de um evento, diretamente aí conversando com vocês. Bom, sobre a pergunta mais diretamente, o que poderia ser a vitória? Eu acho, para nós, as oportunidades de estar na COP, participando dos processos, às vezes não diretamente, mas nossas outras lideranças, nos apresentar, né? Falar de nós para o espaço, para público grande, e isso é uma oportunidade de divulgação mesmo, de muitos diálogos, né? Esse a gente vê como um passo importante. E como um desafio a enfrentar, né? Ainda precisamos construir um processo, né, que me parece ser um caminho longo de confiança, né? Os financiadores, de fato, confiarem em instrumentos criados e geridos por nós, né? E isso faz com que, na nossa percepção, esse apoio também não está chegando do jeito que já deveria chegar, né? Ainda continuamos no espaço muito de falas, né? E não de ação, a concretização de ação, né? Eu acho que essas são as primeiras mensagens que compartilhamos, refletindo sobre o processo. Obrigada.
Olá,
Great.
eu concordo com o que Valéria trouxe, né? Nosso posicionamento é muito parecido, né? Eu acho que algo positivo que eu posso falar é exatamente essa abertura, né? Essas ocupações que nós indígenas estamos fazendo nesses espaços de discussão, de diálogos, né? Internacionais principalmente. Então, esse processo de escuta é muito importante para nós, né? É muito positivo ao longo dos últimos anos, né? Principalmente aí da última COP para essa COP28, então esse processo de escuta é muito importante para nós. E é algo que eu trago um pouco, né, não negativo, mas um desafio, é que a gente precisa realmente de um apoio na prática, não só na fala, né, de uma parceria de fato, né, e também estabelecer esse processo de confiança, né, de parceria mesmo. Acho que também é essa mensagem um pouco inicial que eu gostaria de deixar.
Great, thank you so much. Casey and Jenny, I'm coming to you. You've heard from the Indigenous, groups and leaders. Or what about you? What do you reflect on? Casey, can I start with you first?
Sure. Thank you, Then. I think last year I spoke to Toya from Koweab about the issue of capacity building being on the Indigenous peoples side. And the good thing is that Indigenous peoples have definitely addressed that. You have the leadership of Pudali under Valeria that is now executing grants, receiving more funding and more complex funding. You have Deborah Sanchez now leading Clarify here on the call today. Indigenous peoples across Asia have founded the Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund that will distribute small grants all across Asia. The first ever women's forum in the Congo Basin has called for the first ever Indigenous and local community-led fund for the Congo Basin. And finally, Shandia convened stakeholders at the OECD in Paris to talk about better tracking, accountability, and transparency when it comes to funding for Indigenous peoples. The challenge, unfortunately, still exists on the donor side. We know that in 2021, only 7% of that pledge out of Glasgow went directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And when we dig deeper into those numbers, I'm concerned that it's even less than 7%. So really the challenge still exists on the donor side, and there's more that needs to be done to create more flexible funding. And we need to allow Indigenous peoples and local communities to define themselves what they view as direct funding and financing.
Thanks, Casey. That's a striking number. Jenny, I'd like to come to you for your thoughts.
Thank you very much, and I agree with all the comments that have been said. I think the thing I'm feeling optimistic though that some progress is being made. I mean, from what I've seen over the last 3 years, really, since we launched the pledge in Glasgow, is I have seen progress being made. I think that, I mean, what we're showing is more IPNLC led organisations are being directly funded than we've ever seen before. I really believe it's not just about the 1.7 billion. It's not just about the money in itself. It's about how we're working together as donors, as IPNLC organisations, other partners, civil society organisations. And we've seen a level of dialogue and collaboration and discussions between all of those stakeholders in ways that really had not happened before. It's been really exciting in Montreal, in New York, at COPs, to have leaders from government alongside the stage, alongside discussions, alongside events with IPNLC leaders, with civil society organisations in a way that was not happening before, to really have visibility of this issue area by prime ministers, by presidents on stage in a way, again, we had not seen before. I mean, particularly in New York last month, to have, the ministers from Norway alongside ministers from Brazil, which we didn't even have that minister for IPLC before. I mean, I do see this visibility that the pledge has brought, which again has brought attention to this, and now means there's an accountability commitment from donors, which again, we did not have before on this issue. So I do see positive change, but I really do agree with other comments that it is slow, it is a journey, but at least we are on that journey now together, and there is that accountability and commitment, which again 3 years ago was not there. So I would like to say I agree it's slow, but I am really feeling positive that at least we're having this conversation.
Great, thank you, Jenny. I mean, what I'm hearing from everybody, I think, is it's optimism, right? And I guess the fact that it is happening, the fact that there are openings that didn't exist before, but of course there's always room for improvement, right? But like you said, you know, we are at least on that road now, and the question now, it's there's no question anymore about whether, you know, the IPLCs need funding and that there should be funds. It is now about, okay, how do we make sure that, you know, we can fund them at scale and that well targeted. Deborah, can I just come back to you again? I mean, Casey did a very quick but super useful rundown of, you know, multiple Indigenous-led funds that have started appearing. Could you just give a brief overview in addition to what Casey have said, and whether there are any other funds that, you know, that have come up that are, you know, really interesting and exciting?
Thank you. I will say that we've been seeing like this system of global, regional, and national financial mechanism that is being built, led, and governed by Indigenous peoples, local community in Afro-descendant. And I think there is a few of them, and we can see, for example, at the global level, we are talking about the Community Land Rights and Conservation Finance Initiative that is being incubated in Rights and Resource Initiative Coalition, and with the technical support of Campaign for Nature. And basically, what we're saying is we are this global mechanism, and we are giving grants in all lands and territories. And we are having, for example, grants up to 1 million, and then we have this fiscal sponsor mandate also to grants that are over 50 million. So we are seeing like a scaling up, right? This issue of capacity, this issue of how we scale funds that goes to the ground. And then we have the regional and national funds. I mean, Valeria, my sister here, can talk more about Podali and how it's governed and how it's led. But we see in Pawanka, we see in the IPAS, the Solidarity Fund for the Asia. We see the Mesoamerican Territorial Fund, Nusantara Fund. Also, Amman has a national fund already. And for example, we've been collaborating with Amman's national funds and with the Mesoamerican Territorial Funds, and Clarify is giving grants to them so they can actually build their capacity. For example, in Indonesia with Amman, these grants will go to strengthen the capacity of some of the chapters or some of the members of the organization, the communities that are part of the Amman network. And then in the Mesoamerican, we'll go approximately to 15 projects, and the call for proposal was already launched and finished this month, and they will go, for example, across 5-6 countries, and will go from territorial governance to conservation to community entrepreneurship. So we are seeing that this collaboration and these funds and this system that we are building, this network of funds led by Indigenous peoples and local communities, we are actually working together, we are complementing, we are supporting each other to get that skill to bring that funds directly to the ground.
Great, Deborah, thank you so much. Could I just also ask the audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. I see a lot of comments coming in, and we just want to make sure that, you know, we could get to your questions. So please use the Q&A box. Deborah, my question, I was going to have a follow-up question around, you know, what can be done to make sure that the funds complement each other, but you did actually just now already sort of answer that question on what you're doing to make sure that there's, you know, that there's complementarity. And I just actually wanted to ask perhaps to Valeria and Josimara whether they have any thoughts or anything they want to talk about on this particular aspect as well, to make sure that, you know, all these funds sort of work well together and collaborate and complement each other.
Obrigada, Débora, por esse link também, né, a gente poder falar um pouco desse processo, né, dessa construção da rede, né, mais no âmbito global mesmo. Somos parte, as nossas organizações são parte de uma grande aliança, né, que está representado pelas nossas grandes organizações, que a Débora aqui citou, a MPB, no Brasil, a PIB, COIAB, no país Congo, conforme o Casey já falou, Repaliac, né? Lá na Indonésia, os outros parceiros. Então, estamos aqui num grande bloco, mobilizando e construindo mecanismos, né? E os nossos processos são resultados de debates dos nossos movimentos, das nossas organizações. O Fundo Podali no Brasil é resultado de uma discussão de mais de 10 anos, né? Liderado pela COIAB, assim como a Josimara, que está aqui do meu lado, né? Um fundo local no estado do Amazonas, um processo, um resultado de uma discussão do fundo da organização, que é a Federação das Organizações Indígenas, né? E aqui a gente compartilha com vocês realmente um processo de construção da rede, né? Daqui do chão para esses outros processos. O exemplo de um fundo local para um fundo regional, que é o Fundo Podali, e para os fundos macros no âmbito global, fundo da MPB, né? Então, é um exemplo concreto de como estamos nos organizando e construindo essas alianças. E eu quero compartilhar com vocês também, para além da rede indígena, nós aqui estamos falando da rede indígena no âmbito mais geral, global, mas no Brasil estamos construindo, nos fortalecendo a rede de fundos liderados por movimentos sociais, então, não só indígenas, mas outros parentes que são povos e comunidades tradicionais, quilombolas, né, no âmbito da Amazônia brasileira. Bom, a gente continua, a conversa é muita história. Obrigada.
Gostaria só de, fazendo menção a tudo isso que foi falado agora, a gente consegue perceber que há um movimento global, né, de fundos, de organizações, né, toda uma escala global com um único objetivo, né, de salvar esse planeta, de salvar os nossos povos, de tornar esse mundo melhor, né? Então, acho que isso, como a nossa companheira no início falou, existe um progresso, por mais lento que ele seja, existe um progresso e a gente precisa cada vez mais fortalecer toda essa rede, né?
Great, thank you very much. Obrigado. Casey and Jenny, the next question I have is for both of you, from the donor perspective. Of course, like you said, the good news is that, the funds are there now and the money is being dispersed. But, Casey, as you yourself mentioned, how they're being spent and targeted still needs to be improved. So what do you think needs to be done to change this, to speed this up? Jenny, maybe I can start with you this time.
Thank you. I think this is really at the heart of what we're trying to work on as donors with other stakeholders, is trying to understand what are the most effective ways of getting that funding dispersed, first of all, more quickly, and then second of all, in a way that, we can really build a more effective longer term mechanism. So I think what we're realizing, and Casey, I hope you'll also agree, is there's ways we need to be working perhaps with intermediaries and trusted partners to make sure that can happen at scale more quickly, which means that IPNLC-led organizations can really receive that money, even if not directly, more directly, in a way they can have influence and control over, but building towards actually being able to absorb that directly at scale over those years. I know there's different views on whether, what we're talking about as capacity building is really fair, because obviously that's asking IPNLC-led organisations to adapt to donor requirements to some extent. And I think we're also, accepting that for some donors, in particularly bilateral donors, there'll always be some red lines in terms of reporting and accountability that unfortunately we won't be able to shift. So understanding where those red lines are. But I think what we are looking to do, and I'll speak as a bilateral donor, is trying to dig deeper as to where there are also the yellow lines. Where can we shift? Where can we adapt as donors? And again, that will be a progression, but at least we can actually start to understand that better and see how we can work more effectively. So I think there's also recognition that given we have this collaboration now between philanthropic and bilateral donors, where can we actually collaborate together to understand there's opportunities for philanthropic organisations to fund things at different stages to bilateral donors. And there's also work that bilaterals will be funding that perhaps philanthropic organisations may not. So I think we're also, realising that as governments, we also fund some of the broader systemic reform. We also support work for government capacity building. How can that better complement some of the support directly to IPLCs to be an enabling structure? So I think it's really understanding how we can better have that collaboration, coordination, but also challenge ourselves, particularly where donors have those restrictions, to actually put in place, other mechanisms, even if it may be working through trusted intermediaries and partners, to actually make sure that that's as effective as it can be. So I think it's the shorter, more immediate wins, but making sure that's part of a more structured journey towards actually change at a greater scale.
Thanks, Jenny. Casey, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with Jenny? Do you have anything that you want to add?
Feel free to disagree, Casey, as well, because it is a dialogue. As donors, we come from different angles. So feel free to disagree, Casey.
No, I completely agree with Jenny. I think there's completely a lot of room for private-public partnership. At the same time, I think going into COP28, unfortunately, I still think that some donors don't think that by supporting Indigenous peoples directly, we can achieve climate and biodiversity targets at scale. And I respectfully disagree on all fronts on that regard, because we've been using the statistic for a long time that Indigenous peoples are 4 to 5% of the world's population, and they've been protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. So they've already done it at scale. Now it's the time for donors to really comprehend and understand that direct financing will only help to contribute to achieving those targets.
Thank you. Thanks, Casey. Valeria and Josimara, can I come back to you again, right? Because both of you are leading Indigenous funds for the Amazon. What do you think we need to be doing practically to get funds where they are most needed? And also, very briefly, if you could tell us what the next steps are in terms of, the funds that you're leading. Again, Valeria, perhaps I could start with you.
Vamos inverter. A Josi vai começar.
Ok.
Obrigada.
Bom, obrigada, Jenny, Casey, pelas palavras. Acredito que a gente precisa, de fato, ser reconhecido, né, como um mecanismo financeiro eficaz, que funciona, né, que possui também um papel técnico, ao mesmo tempo que também possui um papel político dentro dos territórios, né? Que a gente trabalha em conjunto com os nossos movimentos, né? Nós, especificamente, trabalhamos em conjunto com o movimento indígena, né? Em conjunto com as nossas bases, com as nossas comunidades, com os nossos povos, o que é muito importante nesse processo todo, né? Então, nós precisamos ser fortalecidos, de fato, né? Que, como o Casey disse, e eu concordo, né? Que esses apoios sejam mais diretos, né? Sem intermediários, que essas pesquisas e essas análises sejam feitas, né? De como esses fundos já existentes funcionam, né? E que a gente comece a fortalecer cada vez mais esse processo de confiança e de diálogo direto com os financiadores, né? Que os doadores possam nos escutar, né? Nos procurem primeiro, antes de procurar os intermediários, né? Antes de fazer os aportes, os apoios, nos procurem, analisem, né? E os próximos passos um pouco acredita que seja esse momento de consolidação desses fundos já existentes, né? Com todos os nossos instrumentos internos bem estabelecidos e que a gente consiga alcançar todo o território indígena possível, né? Todo o território brasileiro. E que essa aliança que foi mencionada, né, pela Valéria no início, se fortaleça também, que todo esse ecossistema se fortaleça, né? Que nós, fundos indígenas, caminhamos juntos nessa grande escala.
Talvez um rápido complemento em relação a isso mais uma vez, a gente fala do que fazer mesmo, né, na prática, para que isso aconteça. Além de nos apresentar, né, o case está aqui, o case é um representante importante para o Fundo Podali, apoia, né, a The Tenure Facility também está acreditando no Podali, né? Eu acho que diálogos de apresentações, de recomendação entre financiadores, elas são muito importantes. Ajuda a construir os processos de confiança, né, da parte dos financiadores para que esses recursos, de fato, cheguem até nós, né? E eles também são parte desse ecossistema, conhecedores dos nossos trabalhos, né? Desses processos importantes que a gente está conduzindo dos nossos territórios e que está fazendo os recursos que a gente está recebendo, de fato, chegarem aos nossos territórios de diversas formas, né? Eu acho que a gente tem outros processos a enfrentar nesse processo de desafio, que é, de fato, uma questão central que a gente tem colocado muito, é como fazer esse recurso chegar respeitando dos povos indígenas, dos povos e comunidades tradicionais, quilombolas, né? Sem que realmente a gente possa colocar a questão das regras como um princípio geral que a gente normalmente já enxerga como isso, como um limitador de acesso, né, desses recursos chegarem. Mas também estamos em
Great, thank you so much for that, both Valeria and Chusumara. Jenny, did you want to sort of just give a brief example as to why sometimes direct funding, bilateral direct funding is can be a challenge?
Thank you very much then. I just wanted to illustrate perhaps where it's not even always a matter of trust or gatekeeping. Sometimes it's purely what we would call, efficiency or effectiveness and value for money, which to fund any program for overseas development aid and taxpayer money we have to respect is, say we had, for the sake of argument, 50 million that we could give to IP&LC organizations and support them. If we were to fund every single one of those organizations directly, that would then place reporting administrative requirements, which would mean it would really not be possible. We would never get the approval to have to work directly with every single one of those, let's say, 25, 50 organizations we could fund. That would require such a large team on a really practical basis to work directly with every single one of those organizations. It would mean we could only fund a very, very small handful. Whereas let's say we work through an intermediary who could manage that, let's say 50 million fund for us, that would mean we can work with a much larger number of organizations, and that intermediary could absorb a lot of the risk, the accountability and the reporting commitments, which would mean that intermediary could work in a way with those organizations which really suits those organizations much better. You would be able to develop those reporting requirements in a way that actually suits you as an organization. Whereas if you're reporting to us, the requirements for administration reporting would be so high, it would mean that realistically, it would not work on a practical level. So sometimes it's purely a matter of being able to work more effectively, and through an intermediary, it would mean that we're able to support IP and LC organizations, and the intermediary, if it's a trusted partner, which is really someone that we can ensure is working with IP and LC organizations very directly, it really just means that it's able to get that funding to IPLCs more directly, but in a way that removes a lot of that burden. So sometimes I would argue it's a very practical way of just meaning we can support IP and LC organizations in a way that otherwise our requirements mean we can't, because of the risk, because of the reporting, and purely because the number of staff that we would require, unfortunately, it would just not be practically possible. So I would just also ask people to come back to how do we make practical solutions work? It's not always just about the trust side.
Great, thank you for adding that, Jenny. I appreciate that. I could see that we already have quite a lot of questions coming through, so I'm going to go through the final round of questions now. I mean, it's been a really interesting conversation, and you know, I could continue asking so many questions, but let's go to the final round. And Deborah, can I start with you again? I'd like all the speakers to actually very briefly, although slowly, so that our translators can do their job, talk about what do you think we need to achieve at COP28 based on the discussion that we have just had. Deborah?
Yes, thank you. I want to have a few reaction also to the Jenny's and Casey's comment. We know that this is being these red flags for the bilateral cooperation, and I think that's why Indigenous peoples, local community are responding with funds, right? So we're creating these big infrastructure funds that will also make the enabling conditions that we can reach more people and we can do it at scale. So I think the thing about intermediary is that issue where Indigenous peoples and local communities are actually the decision makers of the processes. So we need to really think that in a very fine way. So the effective participation is the most important part of every system that we can put. So we can actually say that we are doing this direct funding to Indigenous peoples, even if through several mechanisms, right? So for us, as Clarify, we've been demonstrated progress. So we have 52 active projects. We have 23 in the pipeline. We're supporting a lot of things from advocacy, tenure, security, conservation, organizational capacity, but it's not enough. And you see a lot of the questions in the chat is about how we do get grants, how my organization can access to fund to the ground. So there is still a lot of demands. That funding gap is huge, as Casey mentioned at the very beginning. So I think that we've been demonstrating the reiterate commitment to the goals of the pledges, have demonstrated that there is a common understanding and that we are going to move forward. But now we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples, local community, and Afro-descendant are heard, understood, and respected, and that we are actually in the center of the decision-making process for all the initiatives that are coming.
Thank you, Deborah. Casey, can I go to you next, and then we'll go to Jenny, and then just Valeria and Josimara, I think you had a bit of a connection issue just now. We're just asking the final round of questions before we go to Q&A, asking what do we need to achieve at COP28. Casey.
Yeah, I think there's three things that we need to achieve at COP28. One has been said loud and clear on this call, that we need to let Indigenous peoples and local communities define what direct financing means for them, whether it be through an intermediary or not. I do understand in the case of governments, it's much more complex. And I think Jenny is a shining example of someone who's really trying to think differently when it comes to funding Indigenous peoples and local communities. The second thing is we need to make sure that the just transition is just, and that it respects the rights of Indigenous peoples. and local communities. I think we're seeing the forced eviction of Indigenous peoples in particular places in the name of achieving the world's most pressing climate goals. And I don't think the eviction of peoples needs to happen in order to do that. And then I think finally, Indigenous peoples needed to be included very deeply and meaningfully in the loss and damage discussion.
Great, thank you, and thanks for mentioning the loss and damage as well. It's a tricky issue, isn't it? Everybody seems interested in it, but then nobody seems to be really sure of what the parameters are. Jenny.
I think it is critical to maintain the visibility and to maintain that dialogue, and I think we will certainly already be having that at COP. I'd also like to flag that the next donor annual report will be published at COP. If you haven't read the last one, please do look online. Land Portal actually host our webpage, so please do take a look. And at COP, you will see the latest, I guess, figures, but also the latest narrative from donors on what we've been doing. And of course, I would encourage everybody to challenge, to critique us, but also to do that with the practical, constructive ideas of where you would like to see that moving forward now that we're halfway through the pledge. So yes, I think the critical things are visibility, ongoing constructive challenge, and using that platform and those opportunities.
Great. Josimara and Valeria, your thoughts on what to achieve at COP28 before we open up for Q&A?
Desculpa, a nossa queda aqui, também compartilhar com vocês que são processos, parte do que acontece na Amazônia brasileira, né? O acesso a processos de tecnologia como essa são limitadas, né? E é um pouco o que a gente acabou de passar, mas é parte do processo e dessa construção e melhoria, né? É uma pena que a gente também caiu e não pôde acompanhar os diálogos aí dos demais painelistas, mas vamos lá, o que precisamos alcançar, né, com essa discussão na COP, com base nisso. Eu acho que as mensagens aqui colocadas, já trazidas, elas são importantes nesse sentido mesmo, do espaço ser algo que nos coloca, nos apresenta, né, nos coloca em processos e, por outro lado, a nossa participação mesmo, né? Nós sempre estamos num processo de abrir espaços, ocupar esses espaços nos mais diversos níveis aí, né? Então, acho que é parte desse processo do que a gente está construindo, mas eu gostaria de dizer também, por outro lado, que é muito importante, e com isso convido a todos, né, que têm a oportunidade, no caso de passar aqui no Brasil, na Amazônia brasileira, conhecer as nossas experiências, visitar iniciativas que a gente está apoiando, né? E para que, de fato, possam conhecer a realidade da Amazônia nos seus diversos níveis, processos, né? E conhecer o nosso povo, as nossas iniciativas, que têm sido tão lindas e que têm a participação muito de vocês nesses processos de apoios. E também continuar a acreditar nesse processo, nos apoiando no fortalecimento desses processos de mecanismo mesmo, né? Então, eu acho que era a mensagem mais ou menos final que eu já estou deixando aí. Obrigada. Na POFA.
Complementando, eu acho que o que a gente deseja, de fato, nessa COP28 é que as promessas, né, de financiamento saiam do papel, né, que haja um compromisso com os fundos indígenas de uma atuação conjunta, de uma atuação em parceria, que haja essa imersão que a Valéria citou, né, de entender como nós funcionamos, de não ter só uma visão de baixo, ou, desculpa, de cima para baixo, né? Mas poder estar aqui junto conosco, né? Conhecendo a nossa realidade, conhecendo os nossos resultados e os impactos que esses fundos estão levando para dentro dos territórios, né? Que é importante esse processo de reconhecimento e de imersão mesmo, né? No diálogo, na escuta e em ver com os próprios olhos em como a gente está impactando positivamente todos os nossos territórios. Então, o que nós desejamos nessa COP é que, de fato, tudo isso saia só de falas e comecem a ser práticas efetivas aí por parte, né, dos doadores.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A. We have about 10, 13 minutes, take on a few of the questions already there. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. And of course, if possible, please identify yourself and the organization that you belong to. Now, the first question, I think, excuse me, Deborah, I think you might be the best person to answer, but very open for others to come in as well. The first question actually is asking, is there a global database that can show what type of funds that exist to date at various levels for the Indigenous peoples and local community organizations? Deborah, would you have any idea?
Thank you, Tin. I know there is a lot of partners doing the mapping on the funds, but I don't know if there is a database actually.
Thanks, Deborah. Casey, would you have any idea, or other speakers also any idea if such a database exists?
No, a database doesn't exist, but the Shandia platform is a umbrella in which all Indigenous-led funds are supposed to advocate for direct financing, as well as International Funders for Indigenous Peoples is also creating its own coalition of funds globally, which I know Pudali is a part of.
Okay. And maybe, Casey, since you're here, you could also pick up the next question, which actually relates to private philanthropic donors, is asking how can private philanthropic donors access these global, regional, and national Indigenous-led funds? I'm assuming it is to support them. How does the Christensen Fund do, and what advice do you have for other philanthropic donors? And Jenny, if you have any advice as well, please feel free to come in.
Yeah, so the Christensen Fund puts all of our international grantees, including Indigenous-led funds, through a process called equivalency determination, which essentially makes them a U.S. charity for a number of years. And Pudali's gone through this process. And the beautiful thing about that process, while it's complicated, then all other private donors, philanthropic donors, can access those organizations and those funds as if they were a US-based charity. So that's the case of the Christensen Fund.
Great. Thank you. Anyone wants to add anything, or shall we move on to the next question? Okay. The next question is, which organizations are best able to help Indigenous peoples with mentoring and assisting in organizational development, financial management, monitoring and reporting, project development, proposal development, and the development of advocacy and lobbying programs? So essentially, which organizations are able to help Indigenous peoples with essentially a lot of, I guess, capacity building on running excuse me, these programs. Deborah, Jenny, any thoughts?
Maybe I will say that will depends on each case. For example, as Clarify, we are actually supporting the network, the collaborations, organizations with all these processes. But at the same time, we are also trying to make this exchange where people from the ground can tell donors what are some of the things that are hard for them to comply with, and how we can actually change some of these aspects. For example, we've been working in Southeast Africa with the pastoralist communities, and there we have, like, for example, not required on written report, but we're going to do a gathering. So we have like an annual gathering with all the organizations came, and they can say what they learned from the process, what were the constraints, and how we can move forward. So, for example, if we have this exchange, then we can create some flexibility, because I think I have to be a balance between creating capacity in the organization, but reacting do what is needed with the urgent matter right now in moving funds for that actions on the ground.
Great, thanks so much, Deborah. I'm just wondering if Josimara and Valeria have any practical examples as well in terms of organizations that can help Indigenous populations with these issues and skills.
Eu vou fazer um breve comentário sobre isso, né? Eu acho que uma questão, a partir das nossas reflexões, do fazer interno nosso, é que a gente tem se apoderado do instrumento de intercâmbio, né? A gente está aqui, eu e a Josimara, participando do encontro de fundos comunitários que atuam na Amazônia brasileira, exatamente compartilhando experiências, né? Compartilhando experiências, a partir disso, a construção dos nossos processos, a partir desta reflexão, né? Porque a gente tem um processo de construção que a gente está fazendo respeitando os nossos processos e os nossos modos e, acima de tudo, a nossa visão geral enquanto povos indígenas, né? Então, é muito difícil que alguma instituição, vamos dizer assim, que a gente recomenda, a não ser que são os nossos parceiros que estão aí na caminhada de muito tempo, que nos conhecem, né? Porque isso é importante colocar como a gente trazer contribuição, mas respeitando os direitos, os processos de autodeterminação dos povos indígenas. Esse é um tema central para nós, né? Então, o intercâmbio realmente tem sido muito oportuno para nos qualificarmos e melhorarmos os nossos processos e a adaptação desses intercâmbios para as nossas realidades, né? Então, é o caminho que a gente está trilhando no processo da consolidação dos nossos fundos por aqui, pelo Brasil, na Amazônia brasileira. Obrigada.
E nós podemos perceber também, né, o quanto a gente tem uma maior autonomia, né, na construção e na execução desses processos que fala, né? Nós, povos indígenas, estamos ocupando os espaços, inclusive os espaços técnicos de fazer, né? Então, as parcerias, elas precisam se adaptar nesse novo contexto da maior autonomia dos povos indígenas, né? E como que também é importante que os doadores saibam disso e enxerguem isso, né? Que os nossos parceiros, as grandes ONGs e, né, os intermediários não são os únicos receptores, né? Hoje nós estamos assumindo um papel muito maior do que há alguns anos atrás.
Great, thank you. We're going to have to close in about 6 minutes, so we'll take one more question. This one has actually two parts, so I'm going to ask all of our speakers to come in at some point. But the first part is actually Valeria and Josimara. It's directed towards you, and the first part is, what capacity do you have that enable you to access and manage funds directly from the donors? And then the second part is, for those who do not have that kind of capacity that Valeria and Josimara have, is it not necessary to support them first through so-called intermediaries, I guess, to build the capacity, and then eventually enable them to move away from these intermediaries so that they can get direct funding? So for that second part, it would be great to hear, brief thoughts from Deborah, Jenny, and Casey. But first, Valeria and Josimara, what capacity do you have that allows you to access and manage funds directly?
Eita, desafio de responder rápido, hein? Mas vamos lá, né? A gente tem se organizado, se estruturado, né, concretamente para realizar atividades desta natureza. O Podale, com atuação na Amazônia brasileira, hoje o fundo ele é um instrumento criado pelos povos indígenas, pelas organizações indígenas. Aonde hoje não tem instrumentos, as nossas organizações nos acessam para que nós sejamos o caminho, né, para que nós possamos gerir recursos captado por eles. Isso já acontece no Podali. O Mato Grosso, um estado aqui no Brasil, captou, o povo chavante, captou um recurso e indicou o Podali para ser o seu mecanismo, né? Da forma para que o Podali faça chegar o recurso ao povo chavante, e a gente está organizando isso para a premiação do povo chavante. É concreto as coisas que a gente está fazendo. Ser esse instrumento qualificado e servir ao nosso povo, às nossas organizações, né? Então, o que eu trago um pouco para vocês é concreto a experiência que a gente está construindo por aqui. Obrigada.
Em relação a uma experiência também do Fundo Indígena do Rio Negro, nós temos essa base muito forte do movimento indígena, né, que é a FOIRN, a Federação das Organizações Indígenas, que faz parte da rede da COIAB também, né, a nível Brasil. Então, as nossas organizações nos fortalecem com essa capacidade, né? O que nós ainda estamos nos estruturando, nos consolidando, as nossas organizações nos dão oportunidades e nos abrem espaços para que a gente possa atuar de maneira mais direta com relação a esses financiamentos para essas iniciativas dentro dos territórios, né? Então, as nossas organizações são a nossa base de apoio.
Great, thank you so much for taking that on, despite, like I said, a really difficult challenge of asking you to be brief in your answers. Deborah, do you want to take on the second part of the question?
Thank you. I will say that there is a natural allies and partners to the Indigenous peoples local community and Afro-descendant in the ground. So maybe we can go and work directly with the people, and then they can decide who is the natural ally or who is the person or the organization that they want to be the mentor and work with them to make their capacity. This one important thing. And I think the other important thing is to really understand that the most of the funds goes directly to the communities, right? So, and they decide on how they're going to actually spend these funds on the ground, because sometimes for the capacity building side is a very limited funding. And then, for example, in our case, we are the ones taking, for example, the responsibility of writing the reports and giving that. So we don't pass that to some of our partners and some of our brothers and sisters in the ground. So I think looking at these processes where, for example, from me to my partners, we can have a more flexible way of sharing knowledge and reporting and all that, but that actually I as a fund gets the responsibility to write the report and do the other things. That can be also a model that can be used. But I think the most important part is letting the people on the ground to make the decisions on where, how, and which person or an organization they want to work with.
Thank you, Deborah. Jenny, and then maybe after Casey, we'll perhaps close with you. Any reflections, or just to touch on the final, the second half of that question?
Thank you. I really echo a lot of Deborah's points just now. I think some of the most exciting emerging models, such as the 10-year facility, are those where IP and LC-led organisations can make their own proposals and make their own choices about how they would like to see the money spent and how they can be supported, but where there is still technical support available from organisations to help manage that, and in a way that the IP and LC-led organisations would like to have, rather than that be imposed on them. And I think that really works from the points I made earlier from a bilateral organisation as well, to mean that they are easily able to be funded because we're able to channel that funding through an organisation such as Tenure Facility. So it's a model such as that I think we need to scale up, where it really works for the donors in terms of the reporting, the administration, absorbing the risks, but it can also really work from the other side also in terms of that really proactive and really empowering model, where it's the IPNLC-led organisations who get to design how they would like to see the funds spent, and they are the ones who are doing the implementation with technical support. So that's the kind of model I would really like to see scaled up.
Great, thank you. Casey, final thoughts?
No, I completely agree with Deborah and Jenny's points. I think it's about Indigenous people's right to self-determination. Each case is different. Let the communities decide who they want to work with and define direct finance. If the case is to work with Clarify or Tenure Facility and they think that's direct financing, that's absolutely their decision and a great model. And in other cases, going directly to communities or funds like Pudali is also a great example.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we will have to close this webinar. I would really like to thank the audience for staying with us, and do apologize that we're not able to take all the questions. And of course, I would like to thank all of our speakers, particularly, Josimara and Valeria, who have joined us despite connectivity issues. We really appreciate you being able to stay for the whole hour as well. Can we give all of our speakers a virtual round of applause, please? Thank you so much for your insights. And of course, thank you to the audience as well for your participation. Now, if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into Indigenous financing and issues at COP28, the Tenure Facility will be there, and they are sharing a link where you can register for a couple of the hybrid events that they are organizing. Of course, thanks also to our hosts at the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's been a real pleasure for me to moderate this event, and all the best with COP28. And I hope that, all of what you hope for will come true, and that we can, next year, this time, when we have this conversation, it will be even more optimistic and positive than it has been. Thank you so much. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, or night, and goodbye.